Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this one on February 24th, 2017, and this is episode 21. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. Well, ding dong, Milo's career is over, and it just couldn't have happened to a more horrible person. Let's not get into that. There's plenty of other places celebrating that news. Let's just jump right into the first segment, buying your vote. This past week, Christy Clark delivered the budget that she's going to basically run into the upcoming provincial election on. And I'll concede you were right. There was a MSP cut in there. It looks like MSP fees, the monthly fees most British Columbians have to pay for our healthcare system, are going to be cut in half for most people in the province, for about half the people at least.
Up to $120,000 of family income. As well, they're raising the cutoff at which you don't pay any MSP by $2,000.
Also in the budget, it's the fifth balanced budget in a row, the Liberals are quick to point out. They're highlighting that if we keep on this track, hint, hint, wink, wink, BC should be able to pay off its debt by 2020 or maybe 2021 at the latest. There's a small business tax cut. They're lowering those from 2.5% to 2%. There will also be a cut on the PST on electricity that'll be phased in over the next 2 years. And then on the other side, there will be lots more money for healthcare and for education. They're basically promising to cover potential negotiations they'll have to do for this Supreme Court ruling with the BCTF that they lost, but don't spin it that way anymore. And they're going to put a lot more money into infrastructure, which is desperately needed. So this is pretty much come across to everyone as this is kind of what everyone wanted. There's lots of little things people could have wanted, but no one's like, this is a bad budget.
Yeah, going into an election, this is actually not a bad foundation to build a platform around. There are plenty of people out there who, want to see a little more education or healthcare funding. Overall, they've managed to strike not a bad balance between running a balanced budget, keeping the fiscal house in fairly good order, and increasing service delivery in some key areas.
The NDP response effectively concedes exactly that, because instead of going right after the budget, they tried to spin it as the forget everything budget. Like, the BC Liberals are trying to make you forget the last 14 years of them in power and instead throwing money to buy your votes, which is arguably what's happening because that's what you do going into an election.
Yeah, the BC Liberals' modus operandi seems to be a bit of, just keep things going, and then when it looks like we're, have a big weakness that we're going to potentially take a hit on, throw something together to kind of cover that. In some ways, this kind of follows that pattern where some of the areas where they're touting, education, healthcare, infrastructure, some of the areas they've been criticized for not delivering on enough in the past. Same thing with the MSP premiums, for example. So it's not entirely out of character for them to try and cover their bases at almost the last minute on stuff they've been perceived as being weak on. Although there are definitely some weaknesses, I think, in where they've focused on this. Looking at the infrastructure section, for example, all their highlighted projects are highway projects. Which, okay, that's great if you live in Chilliwack and get stuck in Langley. They're widening a couple sections there and putting a new interchange. But if you live in Vancouver, the lack of highway spending isn't the problem. There just isn't more room for roads in the more built-up areas of the Lower Mainland, and what we really need is more SkyTrains and other transit increases, and they're pretty silent on that.
Well, BC Liberal voters don't live in Metrobank or in downtown Vancouver anymore. This is a point the BC Greens were quick to pick up on. Aside from the too little, too late argument they kind of played, Andrew Weaver also, I think, highlighted the lack of environmental concerns in this budget. There's no rollbacks, but for a government that brought in a carbon tax, they're not raising it because they feel it's not their duty. They're trying to wait for the rest of Canada to catch up. And as you say, the infrastructure spending is going to roads and to highways. It's going to things like the Massey Tunnel bridge replacement that is widely panned by a lot of people who don't want to just see more bridges. We want to see smart infrastructure. And like you're saying, transit and things that can reduce carbon footprints rather than just put more cars on the road.
And while the Massey Tunnel is in need of replacement, it's not seismically up to code anymore, and there's issues with shipping in that channel right now that the tunnel is preventing larger ships from going up into the port facilities up the river. We don't need a 10-lane bridge there, and if anything, this is just going to exacerbate the problems of sprawl in the Lower Mainland. The problem with building more roads is more cars then drive on them, and it's almost always a near zero-sum game to try and build out road infrastructure because of induced demand. And 10 lanes going from 4 is going to induce a lot of demand. I can see there's not a case for a SkyTrain out to Delta right now. There just isn't enough people there, so it doesn't make sense to expand the Canada Line. But maybe we shouldn't be spending quite as much money on quite that big a bridge and put some of that money into, say, the Broadway SkyTrain line, or
at least replacing the Patello Bridge that is actually falling down and very at risk, but is more the Metro Vancouver Mayor's responsibility, so the province doesn't really seem to care. Building that new bridge over the Massey Tunnel is just going to pass all of that traffic down to the Oak Street Bridge, which is already pretty busy. It just moves bottlenecks around, so that's its own quagmire. But bringing it back to the MSP cut, which is a good step, and it's something that they're talking about moving to phasing out. It's a smart policy announcement in that it cuts the legs out of one of the things the NDP and the Greens would be campaigning on. But there's a little devil in the details in here, in that you'll have to know to go to the website to register that you shouldn't be paying twice as much. So it's not an automatic cut. It's if you're aware of the secret kind of thing, which is a nice way for them to then put out a new ad campaign saying, we're giving you this cut, but you have to apply for it. Sort of almost psychologically pushes people to buy into the Liberals' cut and makes them know who's giving it to them. Whereas an automatic cut, you might just forget and go, oh, I just have more money in my pocket this year.
It's definitely a cynical aspect of having to register to get the cut to the MSP premiums. And MSP was never a particularly great program to begin with. So the fact that they're trying to get the credit for it, but there's probably going to be a slow uptake on that, if high uptake at all. And it's one of the areas where they had the broad idea, not too bad, but they just missed the details. So I am glad to see them moving towards phasing out the MSP, because it really is a pretty terrible tax structure. It's effectively a flat tax, and basically you don't get the benefits that user fees do, for example, in a healthcare system where there's a disincentive to go for frivolous visits or whatever. There's an argument to be made that you can structure a healthcare system to include user fees, and there may be some efficiencies and improvements coming from that. But MSP doesn't touch that at all. It's not tied to your usage of the system at all. It's just a flat tax that reaps in $2-something billion for the Liberal government to then spend. So I'm glad to see them getting rid of it, but it would be nice if they were doing it a little more quickly and doing it so everybody automatically got it rather than have to then apply for the reduced premium.
Or that they had gotten rid of it 10 years ago instead of raising the fees year after year, as it's been the case, so that they could be the hero in the end. But there's an interesting sort of strategy with this budget that by cutting all these kind of fees and reducing certain taxes, but then increasing a bunch of other spending because of the fiscal situation of the province that they can do, it puts the NDP in a really tough spot that if they won and if they become government, they then have their fiscal hands tied. They either have to sort of stick on the Liberals' path, at which point people go, well, why wouldn't we have just voted for the Liberals? Or they have to justify more taxes and more spending. So now the Liberals can go into this election saying, here's a path that no one really hates. Most people are actually pretty supportive of, I bet, if you looked around. Or you can go down the risky NDP path of tax and spend, because that's where they'll go.
Yes, the Liberals have positioned themselves quite well on this, in that they're able to highlight increased spending on some key areas and a balanced budget and some tax cuts too. So they kind of cover all their bases and don't give a huge amount of room without having to have someone do something unpopular to significantly change that. So the Liberals have positioned them fairly well, and you do raise the point about where the NDP goes from here, and the Greens too. Where do you think they are going to be able to find some room to differentiate themselves from the Liberals on this without taking on some unpopular positions?
The Greens have a clear position to expand the carbon tax and to really reposition BC as a climate leader. And if you start ratcheting up the carbon tax, then that affords more money to do something with. And if they want to say it's revenue neutral, they could put it down to income tax cuts. I don't think the Greens have positioned that, but don't quote me. I think their ideal strategy would be to put more into green infrastructure and jobs investments as a sort of offset, plus some tax cuts. And the NDP, in their climate plan we talked about a couple of weeks ago, has a sort of softer version of that, slight increases and more funding for green infrastructure and green jobs. The NDP can also talk about trust, because the Liberals are coming forward with all this money now, but when they're talking about forget everything, they are sort of saying, look, this is the government that raised MSPs. This is the government that cut money from education or didn't keep it rising. This is the government that put themselves in the position to make themselves a savior. Do you trust them to actually continue with this next year? Or if things turn sour, are they going to throw public services under the bus as fast as they can? And they'll have to try and play that. It's a really tough angle, I think, because you have to say you'll be the one to put money into things or run a deficit when BC is the only province not. But at the moment, the Liberals and NDP are effectively tied in one of the polls. Main Street Post Media put out a poll this past week showing the NDP and the Liberals tied at 37%, with a lot more people sort of open to going to the NDP than to going to the BC Liberals. A lot of the soft Green voters, even more of the BC Conservative voters who've just parked their vote there. 10% of British Columbians have parked their vote with the BC Conservatives, and we'll get back to them. But more of them are willing to vote BC NDP than BC Liberal, which suggests the NDP can make a strong case that we have a good situation here in BC. The Liberals aren't the ones to make the best use of it. And then they have to be, how much do you trust the NDP as stewards of the economy, which is where the Liberals can come back. And there is just a large pool of undecided voters out there, and those are the people who I think are going to be really looking to see what are the big ideas coming forward, because now is, I think, the time when the BC NDP can really bring forward some big ideas. If they want to go with a status quo platform, people will just go to the Liberals because that's what they've been presented with, a sort of positive, soft progressive status quo, with no one really pulling the Liberals on the right. Like, the Conservatives don't have a leader, which is why they don't have to put so many tax cuts in there and why they can start spending more. No one's calling them out on it. So the right's gone in the province right now, and the Liberals can just kind of drift wherever they want, cutting off the NDP's own platform. And so the NDP needs to take this advantage, maybe, and present some big ideas on where to go with this province. I don't know if we'll see it based on recent history, but maybe.
Moving on to segment 2, the other 10%, brought up the BC Conservatives, and now's a good time to take a few minutes to discuss that rather interesting party hanging out to the Liberals' right.
So the BC Conservative Party right now is without a leader, and we talked about in the fall how they had a leader and then he quit, but then he tried to run for his job again, and then they kind of imploded that because I don't know. I honestly don't know. But now they're kind of rudderless and going into the election. But I wanted to know where they're at, so I looked up their website to try to get a sense of what their response to the budget was. And frankly, it wasn't that different than the NDP's or the Greens, which was just, it's a cynical ruse to just try to buy your votes, that kind of thing. But their website is awful, let's say.
That is one way to describe it.
The first problem is when, and I don't want to spend this whole thing just nitpicking their website, but I think it bears just digging into a little to emphasize how unprepared they are for this election. And yet 10% of British Columbians have parked their vote with this party. When you click on their recent news to try to find their response to the budget, it takes you to a page that then you have to click another link to see the media release. So you have to click multiple times to get one story from the front of their page, and I don't know why. I mean, I have made a few websites, and this seems like it takes more effort than doing it any other way. And then their media releases are just these big walls of text, which is fine. They like writing, but this is the social media age where you use pictures and try to sell a story and make it a bit more colorful and use some of these wonderful things we have on the internet. Of course, in the social media age, your party would probably have more than 600 likes on Facebook and more than 45 followers on Twitter. 45, yes. And that's maybe because their new Twitter handle is at BCCP2017, which either suggests to me they're trying to launch just a 2017 campaign Twitter account, but it also suggests to me maybe they forgot the password to the previous Twitter account and they just had to create a new one. So it's just this like calamity of errors. You try and dig through to find out who their candidates are. You have to look at the Burrard region to figure out who's in Vancouver, which I've never heard Metro Van called the Burrard region.
Weirdest bit of branding
I've seen. There are no candidates anyway. There's a couple interviews happening. Their platform, as the website will tell you, was decided on February 24th, which, that's nice. I don't really care what date they decided it, but at least they're telling you.
Yeah, when I first looked at that, I thought they got confused on when the next election was going to be.
The next one they might be competitive in?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, their strategy seems to be more or less, if we have the Conservative name, someone will think we're a relevant party.
But it's really hard to make that case for your relevancy when one of the press releases you put out is literally titled, "This website is secure," and you're talking about how you're assuring members that your website and data files are not vulnerable to the kind of leaks that hit the BC Liberals data.
Well, that's because the BC Liberals actually have data. I mean, I'm sure the 5 members of the BC Conservatives are going to breathe a sigh of relief knowing their data is secure, but how valuable can that data be?
I don't even think the Conservatives understand what went wrong with the BC Liberals. Like, it wasn't that they got hacked, but I think they're like, oh, they got hacked, but we won't get hacked. And you know why they won't get hacked? Because no one cares. This press release that I'm reading is an image copied and pasted onto their website, like instead of writing the text out. So I can't actually copy this text because it's a screen capture of the wire service pasted onto the website. It's bizarrely bad.
If their website's secure, it's only going to be because they're using such outdated technology none of the modern hacks can interface with it.
At least Conservative Party President Corbyn Mitchell admits, though we are as yet a small party, which is an understatement, I guess, we still have taken appropriate steps to safeguard that private information of our members and supporters. And it's not that I just want to make fun of the Conservatives. We have the BC Liberals essentially coasting right now. They are a broad tent that sort of represents the centrist to the right wing of BC, and our democracy isn't served when they're not being challenged on one flank. Going into the last election, there was fairly significant BC Conservative Party that was threatening to take a couple seats. It ultimately collapsed, possibly as a sort of strategic voting against the NDP, but it did push the BC Liberals to actually try and campaign. With such a poor communications presence, it suggests to me there's no real reason to actually come back and talk about the BC Conservatives again, other than to put them in the realms of the Pirate Party and the Marijuana Party and the other fringe parties of this province.
Yeah, they're not in a good position right now, and it's possible they may re-emerge. The BC Liberal Party, part of it, the reasons it's been fairly successful is it does have a fairly large and motivated kind of grassroots base. And from speaking with a few of them, everybody's still fairly engaged right now with the BC Liberal Party and are willing to kind of, work hard and really fight in this upcoming campaign, even if the rest of the province is pretty meh on the Liberals right now. And the real concern is if Christy Clark doesn't continue to fill that kind of center-right space that the BC Liberal Party traditionally occupies, they are going to potentially see some defections, and that's the case when your grassroots no longer get motivated and some of them start going over to a party on their exposed flank, then it becomes an issue. Third parties often emerge by running in a space that's not occupied. The Reform did it very successfully with the Progressive Conservatives by running up their right side.
I don't see, even with a renewed majority mandate, BC Liberals breaking off and joining this Conservative Party as it stands. Perhaps one would break off as an independent and then consider a sort of hostile takeover. Or maybe it's just that we're so millennial focused, we keep forgetting that the kind of people who vote for the BC Conservative Party aren't on Twitter. They're not on Facebook. They may not even have the internet to look at websites. And so they just know Colin personally and think he's a great guy, and they'll vote for the BC Conservatives for that reason.
Yeah, the BC Conservatives don't seem to be going anywhere, but hey, if you're an ambitious center-right wannabe politician, there's a party ripe for the taking right now.
And at very least, if you want to reach out to them, the BC Conservatives do have a form on their website to contact their platform committee directly if you want to suggest policy directions for them to go. They are asking about your aggravations. That is there something of a provincial nature that aggravates you and that you would like to see corrected? Or just do you have a solution that would improve a provincial issue? You can go to their website, and we'll post a link to that in our show notes for sure, for you to submit all your best ideas to the BC Conservative Party, and maybe they'll adopt them, because I don't know how many ideas they're getting.
I know I certainly have a fair bit of aggravation with BC politics, and I bet a bunch of our listeners do too. So let's help them crowdsource a platform. Send in your ideas and let us know what you're suggesting they adopt.
Yeah, if we get some good ones, we'll read them out on the show next week. All right, well, let's close this shorter episode off with a sort of extended quick takes. There's a few things of note this week. The first being the federal government's been going province by province after it sort of failed to sign a national health accord and doing one-off health accords with individual provinces. And BC is the most recent province to agree to that. Specifically, the agreement we've signed will see $1.4 billion over the next 10 years go to home care and mental health care in BC. We'll also see $10 million to help with the opioid crisis.
It's no surprise the BC government eventually came around on this. Back in the fall when they were trying to negotiate the new health accord, the feds basically had a, take it or leave it approach, more or less, which was, more generous than the previous government's healthcare commitments. It wasn't exactly the amount the provinces were going for. The provinces tried to hold out on it. Of course, they had zero bargaining power because Ottawa was basically saying, here's a check, do you want this money or not? And they didn't really have anything to try and hold against Ottawa. So when that fell apart, New Brunswick was the first to break, and then after that, there's been a slow trickle coming in as provinces realized, man, this extra money's better than just a 3% escalator we were going to get anyway.
Yeah, so Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and Alberta are still holding out. That's three fairly big economies in the country, but BC coming on board is a pretty strong signal to the rest that their time's sort of running out. They're probably going to settle at some point.
Yes, we're the first major province to sign on.
And so it's an ultimate win, I guess, for Justin Trudeau, even if he wanted the pomp and circumstance of a national health accord, but I think he'll be happy to take as many of these kind of agreements as he can get.
Exactly, and I do think there's a little bit of precedential value here, too, in that this new government, but kind of following the same, we're not going to get dragged into a huge kicking and screaming match over healthcare spending, and that I think is overall going to be good for our political discourse around the subject. Speaking of contentious federal-local issues, the Vancouver City Council has passed a motion to request a judicial review of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. This case, it's a review of the BC Liberals' environmental approval of the project. It was launched by the Green Party councillor, Adrienne Carr, and passed with an 8-2 vote in the City Hall. They're basically going to be going to the court and asking, hey, did the Liberal government actually do their job in approving this, or did they cut some corners?
It's not that surprising. Local politicians have been under a lot of pressure, especially the sort of center-left Vision Vancouver, where you have a lot of left-wing activists in Vancouver steadfastly opposed to the Kinder Morgan pipeline. So this vote basically broke down party lines. You had the NPA voting against a judicial review, and you had Vision and the Greens voting for it. It's one of multiple court cases that are going to hold up this project for who knows how long. I don't know if there's a strong case to be made. In the end, we'll just sort of have to see where it goes. But we won't be seeing pipelines for a while, that's for sure. Next up, there's a couple sort of little stories about housing policy in Vancouver. The city is making moves to designate more houses, heritage homes. Canada's got a bad reputation of not really preserving our heritage, but also not having a lot of historic buildings because our country's fairly young, and especially in Vancouver, where everything burnt down in the late 19th century, we don't have a lot of old homes. So it looks like they're sort of expanding the definition and being willing to include things as new as 1940 in there.
Which is a little odd, considering typically heritage is 100 years or more. Especially because, Depression-era housing isn't exactly a, major architectural highlight of Vancouver. It does seem a little weird that they're focusing on this and aiming to try and keep as many houses the way they are when there's such intense pressure in the market to add more housing stock. If anything, this is going in the exact wrong direction. And while they are trying to adjust that a bit by allowing some additional reno space on some of these housing, it just not going to do anything to deal with the actual issue, and covering up to 12,000 homes and making it even harder to develop them is just going to hurt the city's housing in the long run, even if it does actually make those homes a little cheaper themselves. Because of some of the renovation and development restrictions, heritage homes do sell for a little less than a comparable home adjacent to it. But if this is a way to decrease housing costs, it's going exactly the wrong way. The city needs to build more housing, and trying to preserve a 1930s house is not the way to do it.
Switching back to the federal side, the federal government has called 5 by-elections to fill a number of seats that have gone vacant in the last year for a variety of reasons, including Stephen Harper stepping down and Jason Kenney moving to the provincial scene. There's 1 seat in Quebec, 2 in Ontario, and 2 in Calgary. They all went pretty strongly to either the Liberals in the first 3 cases or the Conservatives in the last 2 cases. So there's not a high chance any of them will flip.
These have been held by fairly prominent members of parties. The 1 Quebec seat, that was Stéphane Dion's seat. He's now got ambassadorship in Europe. One of the Ontario seats was John McCallum's seat. And the 2 Alberta ones, it's Stephen Harper and Jason Kenney. They're practically the poster child for the Conservative Party of Canada over the last 10 years. It's unlikely their seats are going to switch.
I still have to give a shout out because Emily Taman, co-host of the Docket podcast, is running for the NDP in Ottawa-Vanier, and I personally wish her luck.
Moving back to BC politics, the Green Party leader, Andrew Weaver, has introduced a private members bill to enable ride sharing. This would basically establish a framework for companies like Uber and Lyft to operate in BC. It's probably a welcome change because, ride sharing is going to be happening, and it would be good if the government started taking steps to set up a framework for this.
BC is one of the few places, it seems like, in the world that Uber hasn't moved into. And I think their policy has been that the Liberals are the kind of government that would eventually bring in favorable regulations from Uber's point of view. And so it's actually kind of surprising it's taking the Green Party to push this. And he's definitely bringing it from the more centrist kind of point of view. There's been a lot of criticism lately of Uber both for their internal practices, but there's also the big questions about how they sort of treat their employees as contractors and whether they're properly paying out benefits and things like that. That's not to say that the cab industry is above board or legit or even good for consumers, because I know I personally avoid Vancouver cabs at all costs after I had a fun trip down Granville Street at 90 kilometers an hour one day coming back from the airport. And I just went, I'll find another way. I will find another way home if I have to, like the Canada Line and public transit. But it's still a policy that BC's behind on, and we need to find a way perhaps to encourage a bit more innovation in that sector, but to do so in a way that protects consumers and protects the people working for these companies.
Yes, it's a welcome change to be trying to introduce some competition into a pretty stagnant and anti-competitive sector of the economy. Hopefully this goes through, but with an election coming up, I imagine this isn't a high priority for the last session of the legislature before the writ drops, and chances are it's going to be a minor election issue in the upcoming vote.
Yeah, this is something the Green Party's been on for a little while now, and so it'll be part of their platform.
And finally, the NDP leadership race is now actually a race. Charlie Angus has become the second person to formally announce their candidacy for Tom Mulcair's job.
Well, he hasn't actually announced it. This was more journalists going studiously through Election Canada filings, as I guess they do these days, and discovering that he filed his papers this week, and Elections Canada kind of put them up there. He's having an event this weekend where it's expected he'll announce his leadership race, but it seems we've kind of entered the era when candidates aren't effective at making big launches anymore. There's a lot of these sort of small scale, like even Peter Julian's launch, he filed his papers in December and then had like a little party in New West last week. And I think it was maybe that spurred Charlie to get in.
It is definitely odd, and it doesn't say something great about the depth of the NDP's bench in terms of their campaign staff and the people who typically set up these sorts of launches. And I wonder how much of that is just a lot of those people went over to Alberta when the NDP government got elected there, but it's a little concerning the two first candidates out of the gate haven't done great campaign launches.
Well, there's also an upcoming election here in BC where the rest of the sort of strategic minds will probably be. But I'm trying to think back out of this long list of Conservative Party candidates who actually had a launch anyone remembers. That was a lot more candidates. None super high profile, except maybe Kevin O'Leary's, but he kind of dragged his launch out over 4 months or something as he hinted. Which
admittedly is a fairly effective way to launch a campaign, but of course that plays into his one strength of showmanship. But we'll be getting to that shortly in our follow-up episode to be released later this week, where we take a special deep dive into the Conservative Party race. And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.